Hi, welcome to the channel. Today, I really want to talk about how I think about making habits that stick so that you can hopefully reach your goals. If you're like me, you probably have trouble really reaching some of those goals, such as getting fit, going to sleep early, meditation. The thing is, if you reach these goals, you feel great about yourself, you can create a positive spiral in your life that just leads to goodness all over the place. But when you fail, it can really take a toll on your motivation and confidence. So depending on how you do it, you can really either create a really nice, positive spiral in your life or a negative one. One of the big challenges with reaching goals is that it often requires long, sustained, repetitive actions, day after day, doing the right thing, often things that don't even really seem natural or pleasant, such as eating healthy. But what if you could form a system that puts these behaviors on autopilot so that you don't really have to think about them, so that they actually become easy? To make this real, let me talk a little bit about how this played out with one of my goals in my own life, which was getting in better shape. Around 20 years ago, when I was just entering high school, I think I maxed out at something like 236 pounds. And today, I'm a much more fit, 155 pounds, feel a lot better about myself. But the main thing I want to bring up right now is that it was a journey with lots of ups and downs, starts and stops, and it was really hard for me to just put into place the behaviors that I needed to do to really maintain that long term. And you know, I didn't see real progress in my life until I actually formed the right habits that would make it stick for the long term, namely exercising regularly, eating healthy. And you know, at some points in my life when I'm really in the flow and just like doing well, a lot of these things actually feel like easier for me, like easier to go and work out than not to work out. And you know, a lot of my friends and my family and coworkers, they think I'm disciplined, or they think I just have lots of willpower. And sometimes it almost feels weird because, at least when I'm like really on it, it actually doesn't feel that way. It actually feels a lot easier than maybe what other people would imagine. So that brings me to, how do you set a good habit? What's important? And you know, there's lots of books written out there, lots of psychologists who are studying this, but I'll tell you what works for me and what I put into place every day for myself. And that really boils down to 3 different principles. The first is consistency. The second is what I call elasticity. And the third is what I call trackability. 3-step thing, hopefully easy to remember. So first is consistency. And when you get this one down, what really happens, at least in my experience, is that a lot of these habits become muscle memory, or what I even like to call the autopilot effect, where you're just kind of doing it and you don't even have to think about it, and it's great because it just doesn't take as much effort. You know, a great example is brushing your teeth every day, which at this point you probably don't really think about as you're doing. Or another example that I like to think about is your commute to work every day, actually. Are you actively thinking about which path and which road you need to go down every time? No, it's in your muscle memory. You just know how to do it. And then, you know, taking it all the way back to the fitness example, there was a stint of time where I was going to CrossFit probably like 5 times a week. It actually felt weird not to go after I had gone, you know, over and over again. That's just the power of consistency. So this is a simple concept, but in real life, it can actually be hard to make this happen. And the only way that I've really found of doing this is that you need to do the behavior regularly for a period of time until it just feels autopilot. Now, during my own trial and error in trying to form habits, there were a few questions around consistency that consistently came up. The first question has always been for me, how often do you have to do a habit for it to be consistent? Is it every day? Is it every other day? Is it every week? Like, what is it? Now, I found in my own personal life that actually the easiest is if you can find some version of the habit that you just do every single day. This is what I now do with exercise, for instance. I do some form of exercise every single day, and now it feels like it's pretty much on autopilot. Now, there are a couple of habits that I've also found that for myself work if I do on sort of a weekly basis. And a good example of this is I actually do a weekly review and reflection every Sunday. And at this point, I've kept it up for years. Now, what I have personally found difficult is to try to make anything else in between work. So doing something every other day or 3 times a week or anything like that, for me, it's just not quite enough to cause that autopilot effect to happen. And so I usually try to, with my habits, either stick to a daily or a weekly cadence, which is a lot easier for my brain to latch onto. The other question that what always come up for me is like, how many days or how many months do you need to do a habit before you finally locked in that magical autopilot effect? There are all sorts of estimates thrown out there and all sorts of research. Is it 21 days? Is it 30 days? Is it a month? Is it like whatever it might be? And in my experience with the habits that I've tried to form, I do find that it is somewhere in that range, but it's really hard to pin down. I think it depends on a lot of things, such as what is the habit that you actually made? How easy is it to do? How consistently have you actually been doing it? But even sticking with a new habit that's easy to do for 21 or 30 days or however long it is can be really hard for people to do. And that's where the other two principles that I mentioned of elasticity and trackability come in. Now that brings me to the second principle, which is elasticity. And this is one that I have just kind of discovered or found out about in the last year or so from a book called Elastic Habits, which I highly recommend. The key principle here is that flexibility equals strength. Like Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. So you really need to have a plan for when life happens. Your plan meets reality, and maybe it's just not quite as easy to do that habit as you thought it might be. Otherwise, an obstacle comes up, all or nothing thinking sits in, and before you know it, you've fallen off track and you've started a negative spiral where you're back to square one and you're feeling sad and demotivated. The basic insight with elasticity is that you need to flex up or down what your habit is, depending on the circumstances. Now, there are at least two different directions that you can think about flexing your habit. One is lateral and the other is vertical. Let me explain with an example from my own life and going back to exercise and fitness. An example of lateral flexibility would be which style of exercise I choose to do in any given day. And so when I have kind of the time and the energy, for me that might mean going to CrossFit, going to the actual gym, but maybe it's a day where I'm super busy or I don't feel as great and feel tired. And so in that case, it might be something more like I go for a walk outside. Or there have even been times where I'm recovering from surgery or an injury. And for me, I still keep up my exercise habit, but it might mean doing some stretching or some physical therapy. So that is the lateral dimension, and really it's just a fancy way of saying you should have some flexibility in the flavor or style of the habit that you choose to do on any given day. The other dimension is the vertical one, and really this is just a fancy way of saying kind of the amount of a given habit that you choose to do in any given day. Going back to my exercise habit, for me this means simply how long I choose to exercise in any given day, no matter what type it is. So for me, it might be 2 minutes and there's not much there, but hey, I still did it. Or 30 minutes, or if I'm feeling really good, a full hour. And what's great about this is that on the days that I'm feeling super ambitious and energized, I can kind of go for that larger goal and I feel great about myself and I've really done something to further my fitness for the future. And on the days where I just don't have as much time or energy, I just choose to do like one of the smaller versions of that habit. And on these days, I know that 2 minutes of exercise isn't gonna really do that much for my fitness, but I know that, hey, it's one of those things that I'm keeping the habit up and just setting myself up for success in the future. And really what it is going back to that first principle of consistency, it's those days where you do that small habit that allow you to kind of maintain that autopilot or muscle memory effect. Now, an example of this where it really came up was there was one night this year where I was just up working really late the night before, a lot of stuff going on at work, and I was really, really tired the next morning. And to top it off, I had meetings again that next morning starting at 8 a.m. And so really not much time to work out before that. So I was super tempted just to skip the workout entirely for that day. But I didn't. I chose hey, I'm gonna do the smaller version of my habit. And so I literally just went up to the rooftop for 5 minutes, did probably 10 push-ups, 10 sit-ups, and then just went back downstairs and started working. And to this day, it is still a really great memory in my mind. And it felt like such a win that I still managed to do something towards my habit, even with everything kind of crazy at work and in a situation where maybe I normally would have just given up. Now, this elasticity stuff might seem like kind of duh to people, but for me it was a real insight, because before this, it would just be, if I didn't have kind of the time or energy to do a full 1 hour gym workout, I just wouldn't do anything for that day. You know, all or nothing thinking, which is horrible. And it just made it easier to fall off track and lose consistency. But ever since I implemented this elasticity into kind of my habit forming strategy, I've been able to exercise pretty much every single day for like the last year, even with COVID and not having access to a gym. And so finally, the third principle, which I call trackability, which now that I think about it, I'm not really sure if that's a real word, but we're just gonna go with it. For me, trackability really encompasses a couple of things. First is, have you defined the habit in a way that is easy to actually measure or track, or even just know whether you did it or not? Say that you're trying to improve your diet and eat healthy, and you just say to yourself, hey, my habit is that I'm going to eat healthy every day. Well, how do you know if you actually ate healthy? What does that actually mean? It's really hard to know. And when it's hard to know, it's hard to hold yourself accountable, and it's hard to actually make any progress. An alternative that is a lot easier to define and easier to know, whether you did it or not, is something much more specific, such as, did I eat less than 2,100 calories today and eat at least 120 grams of protein, which is an example of kind of one of my nutrition goals. The other thing with trackability is kind of what's implied in the name, which is actually, whether or not you should track your habit and whether you're doing it. I've personally gone back and forth on this all throughout my life, but I have landed in a place where I actually think it's really useful to track a lot of these habits, especially in the beginning, and it's something that I still do today. Especially at the beginning, it can be super easy just to simply forget to do your habit because it's a new behavior and it's not part of what's in your autopilot that we mentioned before. For instance, for me, I have tried to form the habit of meditating like several times throughout my life. And it's only been this year that I've actually been able to do it consistently and kind of make the habit stick. And I think the difference between previous attempts and this time was that at the beginning of this time, I actually tracked whether I did it every day. Other times in the past, I would kind of do it for a couple of days and then I would literally just forget to do it. It's not that it was hard to do, it's not that I didn't have time to do, I would just forget. But since I've kind of implemented this, I've pretty much meditated every day for the last 4 or 5 months. So super helpful at the beginning when you're first forming a habit, but I also actually continue to track even after I've kind of reached that autopilot muscle memory phase. It's just a nice way to make sure that I kind of keep going. Now for tracking, there's lots of ways that you can do this. You can use just a simple pen and paper. They have apps out there that do this. For me, the way that I do this is I've created a habit tracker for myself in the productivity tool called Notion. It's pretty simple. I just have a line for each habit and a column for each day of the week. And what you'll notice also is that I have a little badge icon that is different for each day or for kind of different habits. And that's really tied to that elasticity principle that I mentioned before. And it's really tied more specifically to kind of the vertical elasticity. So how much of the habit did I do? And for me, the way I've laid it out, there are 4 different levels of kind of elasticity on the vertical dimension for each habit. A red X means that I just didn't do any form of the habit at all that day, which at this point is kind of rare for me. Usually I do at least a little bit, but it still happens. Now the ribbon is kind of the lowest level, which is still a win, but then it's not as much time or not as much whatever as the middle option, which is the medal icon, or the highest option, which is the trophy, which is I just did an amazing job on that habit that day. For most of my habits, this really just ties to the amount of the habit that I did that day. And so for exercise, for instance, the lowest level might mean like 2 minutes and the highest level might mean an hour or more. So while we're here kind of looking at my habit tracker, actually it might be useful to talk about what happens when you fall off a habit for a while. And in this case, you're looking at my tracker, and for a while I had the habit of trying to go to bed before 10:30 every night, and I fell off for a while. And you can see a couple red X's here. And it took me a while to really kind of get back on track. And I think it's just a good reminder that actually, even after you implement all of this, it's still gonna be kinks in the system that you have to work out. But I was able to eventually kind of get back on this habit track. And now I'm at the point right now, mostly going to bed before 10:30 every night. And so this whole system, while it's not foolproof, I think makes it a ton more likely that you're actually gonna be able to stick to things. So that's quite a bit. 3 principles to making habits. There's a bunch of other topics that come up with habits. If you kind of read about this or try to learn about this, that I'll also just cover quickly. The first topic is around how many different habits you should try to adopt at the same time. The general advice that you'll find out there is that you really only want to do one habit at a time. I think that's generally good advice, but I could also see it being possible for someone to be super motivated and really just want to crush a few different habits at the same time, and maybe that would work for them as long as they were really committed. And so I don't know if it's a hard or fast rule, but when in doubt, one habit at a time. The second topic is around the idea of using cues and environment to really prime yourself for that habit and make it more likely that it will happen. This would be things like having your exercise clothes already out in the morning so that it just reduces the barrier to exercise. Or it could also be like choosing a specific time of the day where you do the habit same time every day, kind of going back to the consistency principle. And so for instance, I do this with my meditation habit where I do it the same time every day. It's right before I go to bed, and that's made it a ton easier. And so I find kind of cues and environment as like really potentially helpful. I don't know if it's as critical as what I'm calling kind of the 3 other principles, but still I would do it if you can kind of make it work. So that's mostly what I wanted to say during this video. So to recap, since it was quite a bit, really 3 principles. The first is consistency, that really helps you get the habit into your muscle memory so that it becomes easy to do. The second is elasticity, that really makes it easier for you to adjust your habit to your life and your circumstances to make it more likely that you'll actually do it. And the final is trackability, which just makes it more likely, especially at the beginning, that you'll actually even remember to do your habit. And then even once it's on autopilot, it's just something that can still just help make sure that you keep doing it. So again, there are a lot of books, a lot of psychological research out there on habits. This is what's worked for me. I hope that you're able to take something out of this video, form better habits, make it more likely that you'll reach your goals, and hopefully leads to peace and happiness and all sorts of other great things. So if you like this video, found value in it, think others would benefit, hit the like button, which will help others find it. And if you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe, which will make it so that you won't miss a single one. Thanks everyone for watching. Peace.